Hi, we're starting here a new section on how to modernize our application architecture for the cloud. And we'll speak about two main things. First of all, we'll speak about how to divide our monolith application into a multi-tiered one. And in the second stage, we'll speak about microservices and how to arrive to an architecture style based on microservices. So this video will be on the web application project from monolith to multi-tiered solution. So our application is in a monolith architecture right now. I will speak about that in a second. Our goal is to transform it in a multi-tiered one in order to enhance the flexibility of the application, and it has also other advantages we'll speak about also. Here is the existing architecture. As you may see, we have different layers which are the client code, which is executed in the browsers. And on the backend side, we have a data store, which is also separated. And in the middle, we have a big block of code, the application itself running, and which has all the necessary code, and it has a presentation, a business logic, model, and data access based on data context classes. All the code presented here is developed in the single monolith project in Visual Studio, right? So now all this project, we intend to divide it into several layers. And this is how we present transformation to end here. First of all, for the front end, we have the presentation of the application and also a model, which will be needed to deserialize the data coming from the API calls. And then we'll have service API, which will expose the business logic by either calculating things or eventually making calls to the data store and serving the information to the presentation model. Now we'll have that at the development level in two projects. One will be the front-end project and the other one will be the service API project. Let's see how we separate the code from the initial project to the second one. And our goal will be to have a set of service APIs, and by looking at the whole logic in our project, we identified three main APIs that we'll expose, which is the music store in our case, a shopping cart, and a no order service, which is also the payment related service. On the front end, we had at origin a home controller, shopping cart controller, store manager, checkout. And also we have two view components, which are the cart summary and general menu, which behave as controllers practically. Now we will take all the business logic and calls to the database from these controllers and refactor everything to move the code to the service API controllers. This is the main work for the refactoring part. How we'll do that? First of all, we'll create a new ASP.NET Core project for the service layer, and we'll reuse the existing project as the front web presentation. We'll copy all the model and data context files and classes to the new project. Also, we'll need eventually to add some NuGet packages related to the data access, for example, entity framework related packages. And then we'll remove all the data context classes from the front web presentation. By that, we'll ensure that no code will be able to call directly the database. We'll set up the configuration in the new service layer project, of course, for the data context, because this project will call directly the database, but also for configuring the web API, the MVC pattern, and so on. So now we'll refactor all the controllers in the old project. We'll take out the business logic code and we'll form the three new controllers within the service API project. We'll reference the connection to the new service API in the front web. Essentially, this is done via some helpers we created, which use mainly HTTP client. And at the end, we'll wire the calls and the presentation controllers to the new service API facade. Let's see all that in the code. First, let's compare the structure of the solutions before and after the refactoring to the N-tier architecture style. So in the initial solution, we have a single project, a monolith one, whether in the new one we have two projects, the MVC Music Store and the new added project, which is MVC Music Store Service. This project is a classical ASP.NET Core application, so I've added it with solution add new project. If we take a look at the controllers, we see that we have here the 5 initial controllers, and in the front web presentation project we still have the same 5 controllers, but we'll see later that the content will be different actually. The extensions folder is here, unchanged, and here we have a new helpers project containing an API helper and context helper and shopping cart helper. The models folder is replicated actually in both MVC Music Store and MVC Music Store project. But in the MVC Music Store project, we removed actually the database context file, the music store entities, and the sample data file. Speaking about view related files, view components, view models, and views, they are unchanged in a project as before. In the MVC Music Store service, we have moved the migrations folder because it's fully related to the database update and migration. Now let's take a look at some details in the files that have changed. For example, the checkout controller now initiates an API helper, and instead of calling directly the database, we make calls to the API helper. Let's see this API helper. It is simply a set of methods that use HTTP client and create calls in post async and set up different aspects of, for example, JSON serializer. This in order to avoid infinite loops for the objects that have cross-reference inside, for the hierarchies like albums, genres, things like that. So this is essentially the API helper. At the end, the shopping cart helper has all the code related to the cart ID and in particular the session-related code. It's a very important section of code. Here we have actually separated the getCartID method with the setCartID. We'll use that later. So let's take a look at other controllers. For example, whole controller. We see also calls to the APIs. Shopping cart. We respect the same structure of the initial controller, but we move the calls to the APIs. Let's take a look at service API controllers. First of all, store service controller. It has the most resemblance to the initial controller by having these methods calling directly the database context. So essentially, all this code is related to these calls to the database. Finally, let's look at the configuration. We will switch between configurations files in the front web application and the service application. The front web has now only the configurations related to the front, the cookie policy options session, distributed Redis cache. This is very interesting because actually here we have an option to use the cache on the front web, on the service layer, or on both of them. For this case, to simplify the example, I kept the Redis cache utilization in the front end. Also in the front end, there's an aspect related to the session, and remember that Azure Redis cache is the provider for the session persistence. So then we have the classical MVC configuration. We added some JSON options also for avoiding infinite loops. And then we have still the configuration to the blob static files. And this is essentially the configuration. All the rest of it is moved to the service starter file. By that, I mean the database context configuration. And of course, we have specific MVC setup here also, because it's still an MVC engine used in the API. Finally, in the app settings JSON, we don't have here any more connection string related to the database, but we have a services block, which I created specifically to incorporate the service API. And the app settings JSON in the service layer includes the connection strings to the music store entities right now. Both of the projects are instrumented with application insights, by the way. So let's run these projects. We'll actually configure to launch both projects at once. And you see here a call to the API. And here we have the well-known image by now of our sample web application. One last aspect to be noted is that for simplification reasons, the API is not authenticated at this stage. So once we saw that, we understood now what the effort we have to do in a similar monolithic project in order to be adapted to multi-tier or n-tier architecture. We see that sometimes it's a bit tedious, especially if the initial architecture wasn't so strict, I would say. At the end, the value is there because we will definitely need now to respect the rules imposed by this n-tier architecture, and this will ensure much more robust application.